Hey guys, today we wanted to try something different and have a discussion on some videos that we released recently from our forgiveness series. And we want to talk about the practical ways of how to forgive. In one of those points, we want to identify unforgiveness because the reality is we don't always know when it's there. It can be hidden, and we want to just see how do we actually identify that, so we don't go on living with that unforgiveness, as we know the Bible talks a lot about making sure that we forgive. So let's talk about that.
So as you guys probably know, I usually am the one that does the videos for Loving Theology, and I'm usually just sort of discussing our content. I thought though that maybe over time it might be good to introduce a little bit of variety, and so I thought maybe this time we would do something different by inviting Monica on to discuss this series with us and talk about forgiveness in more of a conversational format. But after the first few takes, we quickly figured out that if you invite Monica, you invite Evelyn. And she just didn't want to be by herself. She wanted to hang out with us, which is totally fine. So today we get two guests for the price of one. But like Monica said, I want to take this series and try to make it very practical for everyone and talk about how do we forgive? What does that process look like? I think the first step, if you will, in that process is identifying whenever we need to forgive or identifying unforgiveness. And like Monica said, I think it can be hard to identify whenever we're holding unforgiveness. It's something that sort of sneaks up on all of us. Mm-hmm. And if I were to express maybe why that's true for me, and I think why it's true for us generally, is because we think of forgiveness like a checkbox rather than like a cycle. And I think that sometimes forgiveness can actually be a process that's something like a cycle where mm-hmm. we go through and we genuinely forgive someone, we genuinely release something, we feel a sense of release, and something really does happen there. Mm-hmm. But then give it a little bit of time and we start thinking about it again, and something else maybe about it, or maybe even the same thing, starts to bother us again, and it slowly builds up into unforgiveness. And we sort of think to ourselves, well, no, I already checked that box, I already forgave them, I already did that. But the reality is, well, we need to do it again. Sometimes it just, even if it's the same offense, we just kind of have to go back through that cycle again. And maybe what might be helpful is to, essentially what I'm saying is that I think we need to be vigilant for the symptoms, if you will, of unforgiveness and what unforgiveness looks like. I think it can be different for each person, what sort of those symptoms are and how unforgiveness sort of, presents itself in each of us. So maybe Monica, you could share a little bit about how do you identify whenever you're feeling some sense of unforgiveness? How does it sort of present itself in you?
Yeah, so I have a few ways that I've recognized. One is when I start thinking about it, I think this is pretty common. You just feel emotional about it. You can feel angry, embarrassed, resentful. There's just a lot of things that sometimes I'm taking a step back and just thinking about, like, how is that making me feel? And it doesn't have to be incredibly strong feelings. It's just like us, it can be a slight feeling and you can realize, like, oh, that's still bothering me. Another thing that I definitely find myself doing is I'll come to Joseph and I'll just talk about it. And he just kindly, tells me, like, that seems like that's bugging you.
Mostly kindly.
Yeah. Most of the time you're nice about it. But, I can get offended and I'm like, what? Like, that's not bugging me. And then I realize, like, I just talked a half hour about it. I think that's bugging me. So yeah, sometimes you think you're over it. Another thing I can definitely do with just my personality is I like to hide things and not feel them and like they never happened. And so I can really tuck away some unforgiveness in some spots, and then all of a sudden, I feel like I'm reacting out of that hurt in the past. And I, in my prayer time, I can realize, like, oh wow, like that's still bugging me, or that's bugging me, and I have some emotions with that are not healthy, and they're causing me to react in certain ways in different situations. So yeah, that plays out, I think, most frequently, is I just like to hide that.
Yeah, I understand. And I think, each of us, sort of unforgiveness presents itself slightly differently. But once we've identified that we have some unforgiveness in our hearts, first of all, that's okay. It is a struggle of life. That is not a problem. I definitely have that happen for me on multiple occasions. But once we've identified that, I think the next step is to find motivation, or find, I like the word better, inspiration to forgive. And sometimes that can be hard because part of unforgiveness is that you're still kind of upset about something and you still feel like, it's not fair to simply just let it go. So I think really finding motivation to want to forgive is sort of that next step. And sometimes that's easier and sometimes that's harder. It just kind of depends on the circumstance and everything. So I think probably where I'd like to maybe take us here in terms of identifying ways to be inspired to forgive is to start with something somewhat unrelated, which is just our general gratitude towards God. I think if we just take a step back, forget about the situation for a minute, forget about what we're trying to do. Let's just take a minute and appreciate who God is and get our hearts sort of in the place where we're grateful to him for what he's done for us, because he has done a lot for us. We talked some about that in the post in terms of the way that what Christ has forgiven us has sort of set us free to have a relationship with him that's meaningful and to give us a sense of comfort and companionship with him, to set us free from the bondage of sin. There's so much that he's done for us. He truly is our friend, and there's so much that he's done for us. And as we think about that, I think my hope is that as we sort of consider what he's done for us, it motivates us to say, God, what can I do in return? And one of the things that Jesus makes clear that he wants us to do in return, and this comes from the parable of the unforgiving servant, which is something we talked about in the first post, is that he makes it clear that he wants us to forgive others. That whenever he has forgiven us, he wants us to follow that example and forgive others. And I love in that parable how he doesn't try to diminish, just like we've tried to do here in this video, he doesn't try to diminish the pain of, or the challenge of forgiving people, especially whenever they've hurt us. But whenever you think about it in the context of how grateful we ought to be, if you will, going with that parable, to the king who forgave us such a huge debt, then that can help us to sort of be motivated to want to basically say, God, what can we do for you? The other thing is that if we recognize basically being grateful to God for how he has sort of what he's done for us, but also grateful to God for the fact that he is good, that what he desires for us is good. And whenever we put some faith into that, trusting that what he wants is good for us, then whenever we see his instruction to us to forgive others, we can trust that that comes from a place that us forgiving someone else can actually be good for us, that it can actually be a release for us. And that's what we talked somewhat in the second post about in terms of he promises to repay us whenever we forgive with the good that he has for us, which is peace and love and joy, all of which come from releasing that burden of unforgiveness. Monica, maybe you could share a little bit about, just sort of whether it's maybe not a specific example, but just an example of, how you've sort of felt that benefit, if you will, of releasing that unforgiveness and finding forgiveness, finding motivation to forgive.
Yeah, so I feel like something new was shown to me by God, and when I have had the opportunity to forgive something very difficult, and it shows the Lord's mercy for us, and when we choose to forgive others, and you think about it, this is time when I've been praying and talking with the Lord about some very difficult things, and he has shown me how he has forgiven me for everything I have done, and I've had the opportunity to forgive somebody else and shown and participate in that mercy and that love that God gives us, and that feeling of releasing somebody and just showing them love in place of that unforgiveness. And so that's been really beneficial for me in having peace and joy and being able to pray blessings over someone that might have, hurt me. And it's been hard to really let go.
Yeah. I think for me, one of my symptoms of unforgiveness is just, it makes me so distracted. It sort of absorbs my thoughts. And just, I can tell whenever I get through that peace sort of takes place of that distraction, where I can really sort of then focus on what else there's to do. And also I think it frees me up to love them. And at a certain level, I think that helps me even in the process of being grace-filled with myself and my own mistakes, is whenever I work through that with other people, then it helps me to feel a sense of this is what God wanted for them. And then it just kind of gives you that pivotal moment where you realize, like, that's what God wants for me too.
Yeah.
So I think even the process of forgiving others helps us to learn how see Christ's heart and how he sees us as well. Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason why God wants us to do that. Now, so we've talked about identifying unforgiveness, and then we've talked about getting motivated or inspired, I think is a better word, to forgive. But whenever it's really difficult, sometimes you may want to forgive. You may know that you're struggling to forgive, but it's still really hard to actually let go. And I think, if you will, kind of the actual, substance or the process of forgiveness really comes down, at least in my experience, to a conversation. Whenever it's really difficult, it comes down to a conversation with God where I just talk honestly about, God, I'm really not happy with what happened here. I feel like it was very unfair. I feel like, no one has really had to pay for, what happened here. No one's being held accountable, if you will. And it's really frustrating to me. And I feel like if I let it go, then no one is ever going to hold them accountable. I'm the last person here. I need to do something here, God. Like, this feels like sort of almost like an issue of righteousness sometimes. At least that's how it presents itself for me. And that's really a lot of times my struggle. And then I just say, but God, I know that you want me to forgive, but is this a situation where I'm supposed to, or what does unforgiveness look like here? Just help me to see this situation through your perspective. And I think just sometimes that process of really just sort of, just first of all, just talking, because God really, I think he genuinely does just listen, allow us to sort of take a little bit of room and listen to us and let us just sort of express what's on our heart, right or wrong, unbecoming, or, the perfect example of Christianity, doesn't matter. Just be yourself, express where you're at. And then look for that feedback too, because he's not there. He doesn't stop at just listening to us, but he also helps us to change our perspective. Monica, maybe, I don't know, I sort of described my experience of the process. What tweaks would you add to that, or maybe share a little bit about your process for going through whenever forgiveness is hard?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation that I have with God, and being real, as vain as my feelings might be, or just as superficial, or that's not the Christian thing to think or feel, and you just tell God. And one of my favorite things that I heard once, and I love sharing, is God can handle anything and everything. I mean, there's times in my life I've felt so much anger or so much desire for revenge or whatever, and those are not the Christian thing to feel, but God can handle it. And he can, even if it's disappointment with him, anger towards him, and you need to forgive, him for something, he can handle all and everything. And once I've been able to be real and know that he accepts me and loves me just the same, and he walks me through it, and it's a conversation, it's not just a monologue, it's a dialogue where he comes and he talks to me about it with bringing me that peace and that joy that we talked about earlier, and just being able to help me walk through releasing and showing me his love for that person, and his heart and the desire of what he wishes for that person, which we all know is for everyone to come to the Lord and to know his love. And so that has always helped me, is to see, like, hey God, how do you, he shows me, like, this is the way I see them, this is how I see this person, and it helps me really soften my heart and have that inspiration to release it and let go, and to forgive.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you as we sort of maybe put some rubber to the road, if you will, in terms of what this series looks like and how to maybe walk this out a little bit. You mentioned something there at the end that I thought was pretty interesting in terms of, going through a process, even sometimes of, whenever God, has sort of done something that's difficult for us to understand, and it's hard for us to reconcile with. And I think there's a process there of, I don't know if I would describe it as forgiving God so much as I would describe it as an honest discussion of, God, here's what you did or you didn't do. Here's what I wanted you to do. And the two don't connect. And honestly, it's a little bit difficult. It's offensive even. And Jesus even said, blessed are you if you're not offended in me. So it's understandable sometimes that what God does is offensive. It's hard to be okay with. But a lot of that, sort of process there is meant to help us to identify even sometimes places where we need to let go and trust God and have something of a different perspective even sometimes around what is important and how He is producing good in us. And that's something that we actually talk a lot about in our series on His companionship, His love and suffering. And we talk about His companionship in our distress. And I think I really, as I wrote that, one of the things that really occurred to me is if I set aside for a minute what I wish that He would do for me as God, I begin to see how much He does do for me as my friend.
Yeah.
Whenever I set aside what I wish He would do for me with His power, I begin to see how much He does for me with His presence. And I think that going through that process, we can begin to see what maybe originally was something hard to sort of be okay with our relationship with God, actually is an example where He, whenever we see it through what He was doing in the process, and I think it's okay to ask those questions of God, where were you in this process? Yeah. That then we can really sort of engage and engage with Him and see where He was in this process. And I guarantee you that whenever you see that, you'll see His love and compassion, and I think you'll grow in love for Him. So I think there's something even to that process. So hopefully, again, this was helpful to you. I hope that you are able to watch some of the other videos from the series if you haven't yet. And I hope that this can help you maybe take one step closer to being able to release that burden of unforgiveness, because I promise that it's worth it, but I understand that it's difficult. We definitely have been there and are there every now and then. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
If you would like more content, don't forget to click the subscribe button. In the description below, you can see links to more videos you might find helpful. You can also subscribe to our email at lovingtheology.com, check out our podcasts, or follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for joining us.